Myself, my name is Eric McGeer, and I've been invited to give a presentation today on the Epitaphs from the Great War, subject of long-standing interest to me, because in a sense, what we're talking about with Bob is sort of the beginning of the soldiers' careers, their attestation papers, their careers, and so forth. But what I'm going to look at with this presentation is the last words about them. Poor souls who were killed, buried overseas, and what the epitaphs have to tell us about the Great War. It's been hiding in plain sight for about 100 years, these epitaphs on the gravestones of the soldiers. And some of them are extremely moving, some of them are very revealing of attitudes of the time, but I think they help us to understand what people made of what had happened. This catastrophe of the First World War, which has been so unexpected and so catastrophic in scope. And so when we look at the epitaphs, we have a chance to see what the families tried to do to console themselves, to find consolation they might even extend to others. So if we get the next one, we're all familiar, and Bob showed some slides as well, that the devastation of the First World War, I think, as a war that's exceeded anything that had ever been fought before. And I try to tell this to my students who are in high school, and the First World War might as well be the Trojan War, so far back there. But to give them an idea of just the destruction that was unleashed by fully industrialized, fully mobilized countries, and why the war was so static, why it was so consumptive of human life. And the photos, in a sense, capture the physical endurance and the misery of the First World War. And I've always told my students, nobody really won the war. One side just outlasted the other. And of course, with the infusion of the Americans in the end, which pretty much told the Germans that they had no further hope of winning. They were just outmanned, outsupplied. The balance had tilted so heavily against them, that was it. But nobody really won it. One side just couldn't do it anymore. Okay. And the other thing, too, and having been to the battlefield many times, as I suspect some of you have as well, is how much remains. I mean, here's an observation post on the Somme to watch the artillery barrage. The wires that they used to keep the barbed wire in, they could screw into the ground to avoid hammering at night so they could sound and attract fire. But these are still used by farmers in the fields, as you see here, because they're still lying around. Here are shells that are still picked up in the battlefield, and it's still dangerous to handle these. There are still people killed and maimed by shells they pick up 100 years after the war. And then if you've been to Vinny, you're familiar with the long tunnel system the Canadians built to drive their lines as close to the Germans as they could. But they're almost like a little underground city with cots and writing desks and these long tunnels where the soldiers gathered before the assault because they were out of the range of artillery. But they were perfectly safe down there, and probably quite a few of them didn't want to come out again. The remnants of the First World War are quite striking. And then, of course, I try to tell my students how much of a presence we've left in Europe. And here's the famous monument at Vancouver Corner of the British Canadian, the very, very solemn, very, very mournful monument, a soldier with his head bowed in memory of the fallen at the Battle of Ypres in 1915. Let me get the next one. And there it is from the front. You see this very austere, very somber memorial. And what I try to point out to students is that most of the memorials are not triumphant. They don't, like we won or something. They're not vaunting the victory they won. They're tributes to the fallen, not to the victory. And I think that's something else about the First World War. That is the absence of triumphalism in the monuments, which is very, very impressive. Rather, they're attitudes of mourning. And of course, with the great memorial of Vinny Ridge, a hope that it would never happen again. So it's a very different kind of monumental commemoration. And it strikes a very different tone than what you'll see in other wars, where the triumph is represented rather than the horrendous cost. And then there's just a little plaque on the memorial itself to commemorate the people who stood against the German gas attack. And for students today, this is all a long time ago, but to say the first time that anybody realized there was a Canada was probably in 1915, this inconsequential little British Dominion, and all of a sudden, even the Americans noticed that they had stood up to the gas attack, so that it would sort of put us on the map. Okay, the next one. And here we are at Vinny, probably the greatest monument on the Western Front. And again, the symbolism of it, you know the effort that went into creating this took years and years and years. But the allegorical figures here, including the one on the far end, where really it's a symbolism from the Bible that we shall beat our swords into plowshares and our pruning hooks, our lances into pruning hooks. There will be an end to war. And of course, the figure of the Mother of Canada mourning her dead, symbolized by the empty sarcophagus down here. Can I get to the next one? And then, of course, the stones that were put on the various battlefields. There are 6 of these along the Western Front. This commemorates the breakthrough in August of 1918 and the beginning of the 100 Days near Amiens, where the Canadians and the Australians basically turned the tide of the war and unleashed the offensive that got the Germans to throw the towel in on November 11, 1918. So this glorious phase of about 3.5 months where the Canadians spearhead the Allied drive to victory. But it had come at a horrendous cost. This is Tynecott Cemetery in Belgium, very close to Passchendaele. And these are some of the bunkers that defended that position. And a lot of the Australian soldiers buried around them were killed in the effort to take them, including 2 Victoria Cross runners buried right by the places they were killed. The cross of sacrifice was placed over another German bunker at that end, and then built into the wall here are 2 other German bunkers. So it was a great fortress, and they simply superimposed the cemetery on top. But what's striking about this one, I think it encapsulates the First World War. If you had to have one picture of the First World War, this would be it. Nearly 90% of these graves are unidentified. They come from every year of the war, 1914 through 18. Every dominion of the British Empire is represented. And it is, in a sense, the war is just so, this little jigsaw graves up here was where it began, and orderly presentation of graves afterwards. The immense effort to commemorate the fallen. It took 20 years. They were just cleaning up the First World War battlefields when the Second World War started. So if I may get the next one. Then we get these, hundreds of them, nearly 600 along the Western Front. These little ones, instead of having 12,000 the way the other one did, this has 50 or 60. But they would go to such an effort to give individual commemoration to the soldiers. Let's say this Herculean task of individual commemoration with a gravestone or a name on a memorial to the missing. Okay, and then of course you get this, like the men engaged. There are 55,000 names inscribed here, including 6,700 Canadian names of the guys who went missing in Flanders Fields. They had no idea who they were or where they were. They still find them. In other words, it was the first war in history that created memorials to the people who not just been killed, but obliterated. And I try to give my students a sense of that. This war was so destructive, it not only killed people, it just erased any trace that walked the earth. And of course, when this was built in 1928, there was a radio broadcast back to England in which one of the generals who had served in the Western Front assured the families, your son isn't missing. His name is here. You've got a place to come to commemorate the fallen. At long last, 10 years after the war. So after all that, the figure of Canada in the morning of dead, all the mothers who have been bereaved, all of this, all the symbolic, we get to the individual expressions of grief where the families could, for a small cost, put an inscription on the headstone. These are headstones near Boulogne in France, and just to say, sometimes it's very simple, but very effective because instead of dealing with millions of anonymous casualties, for a moment you get to see one at a time, And here's a Toronto boy, our only son, who loved peace, but Canada he served. And this young man actually taught religion and rhetoric at Trinity College and in the University of Toronto, and went overseas in 1960 and was killed in the battles that followed the invasion in the sector around Lens. But for Toronto, it's very significant as well because something in the order of 10,000 young men from Toronto died in the Great War. You think of Toronto at that time, the population it had, you would have known, everyone would have known someone who lost a family member during the war. And of course, when the reports of First Ypres came in 1915, and people took a look at the casualties, it was such a shock to the city to see that the young men in the city were being killed in droves in this battle, and it went on through the war. So again, the poignancy of that, he's one of 10,000 Toronto boys, of whom this might be said. This is a theme that's very constant in the epitaphs, especially for people in Canada or Australia, South Africa, so far from the battlefields of France or Flanders that they weren't there when their son was killed. They weren't there to bid their husband farewell. The very cruel parting that the war imposed on them. Not only had they lost them, but they'd never seen them. They had them for 2 or 3 years, and then of course when the news came, that was it. There was no farewell, there was no chance to summarize what their lives had been together. So you get this very, very often. No loved ones stood around to do the last farewell. And it ties in with a very common theme in the epitaphs. The grave is so far away, I'll never see it. And so often I have a prayer from a mother, would somebody please lay a flower on my son's grave? Something to connect them to a grave they would not likely have never seen. And again, it's heartbreaking to think these families too poor to cross the Atlantic to visit his son's grave, separated by all that distance and all that time, and this sort of abstract notion of a son buried somewhere in France or Flanders. The epitaph becomes the only way the family can have a meaningful grave. I think that was a very important consideration for England. It was the only thing they could contribute to a grave site they'd never seen. Now, in effect, if you go to a lot of the small towns in Ontario, you have these looks at the plaques of the people who went, we see 4 or 5 brothers all went. This could happen. There were 6 brothers in all answered the call. 1 crippled, 3 killed. You think of the family simply decimated by the war. And of course, the famous story of Mrs. Woods in Winnipeg, who lost 8 of her sons. And when the Living Memorial was dedicated, the Prince of Wales was there as a pray God now it shall not happen again. Well, when people criticize the appeasement of the 1930s, and why didn't we stand up to Hitler? Why didn't we take a stand against the dictator? This is what they remember. No one wanted to listen. And I think in order to understand the 1930s, you have to go back to this and see that no one could have hoped for a repeat of what they've been through. And it was only 20 years in the past when the Second World War began. On stage now it was 20 minutes and about 10 minutes. 12 years of 10 minutes. So in other words, it just happened. There was another one about to start. So I think some of the trepidation of the Second World War is explained by this. Okay. This is a very common one on epitaphs as well. A brother who was lost was commemorated on the gravestone of his other brother who was killed. This is very, very common. They never found the body of the other brother, so they had to commemorate him when the other brother was killed, and so they could commemorate 2 on a single headstone. Sometimes brothers are buried beneath the same headstone, as the family has requested, but often there's this very lonely sort of message to say that we've lost 2 brothers, one was identified, one was not, so we have to commemorate them both like this. Okay. And then often, it strikes you about the epitaphs, they only had so much room. They only had 66 characters, really, each letter in space. So they had to get it into a fairly compact space. So often they're very simple, and their simplicity makes them all the more telling. They're not prologues, verbose. The commission discouraged that. They wanted very straightforward, very simple epitaphs. They didn't want long screeds about this. And often you get this: I am born, my country needs me. The soldier had said on the list. This is idealism or sense of duty or service. And what's very striking sometimes is that you get a lot of this from the casualties killed in 1917 and 18, but they were 1914 volunteers. My son enlisted in 1915. In other words, they're saying, my son went voluntarily. You didn't have to conscript him. And I think these are the last shots in the battle over conscription where they say, these are the guys who did their duty. They didn't need the military service I could get them overseas. They didn't win. And that's a point of pride to the families. And they often would mention that if someone was a volunteer. Now, they didn't say that it wasn't a conscript, but they didn't mention the word conscript on the headstone, but they could say that by implication that my son volunteered. They didn't have to force him over. He went under the sense of duty. And often these very simple declarations, sometimes out of the mouths of the soldiers themselves. Okay. And of course, after 1916, when the manpower crisis becomes much more acute, you get this. And this is amazing. The guys were rejected 4 times, accepted the 5th. Rest after labor. In other words, some of them are so desperate to get in that you find this kind of thing. But I think that 1916 is a real turning point here, because it becomes apparent in the winter of 1916 that the voluntary enlistments are just not going to keep the army under restraint. So all of a sudden the physical standards come down. All of a sudden they're turning a blind eye to some of the defects they might have kept them on in 1914. They're ready to take anybody with a pulse after 1916. Anybody will come sign up. So I think this is the story behind this headstone. As you can see the decline in recruiting standards. And here's a guy who probably knocked on the door until they took him. And that's where it caught him, unfortunately. Then you get these bits of heroism sometimes that are lost to history except on the headstone. And this is very common as well. Last words to his comrade, go on, I'll manage. And there are others to say, he saved the comrade while going under fire. He pulled a wounded man out of the line of fire. He kept the line open under shell fire. His captain said he was the bravest soldier he ever saw. And the families often took great pride in the courage that their son and their father had shown, and they put that, either a quotation or some sort of citation, sometimes from a medal citation, sometimes from a letter of condolence from his commanding officer, or something that his buddies had relayed to the family in a letter of condolence afterward to say, your son died in a heroic way, and here self-sacrifice was often very important as well, because there was this connection too. This was a sacrifice. It wasn't a death in battle. It was a sacrifice in the Christian meaning of the term, which people at that time took very, very seriously. And I'll come back to that. This is another astounding one. Here's a guy who's in the New Zealand forces. He was unfit, had been lost the sight of an eye. He re-enlisted in Vancouver. And of course, he's killed in 1918. He's another of these guys who didn't take anybody. So sometimes the epitaphs contain these remarkable stories of a guy who just wanted to get in, or whatever reasons he gave, or these very interesting little stories here of this guy who must, one-eyed soldier going back to take it up with the Germans again. So he didn't have enough. He was one boat ride from home. get a boat in Vancouver, back in New Zealand, but you didn't listen to them the other way. So there we go. All right? And then what's very interesting too, we don't find many, but there are some. Of course, French Canadians wanted no part of the First World War. It wasn't their war. The real Prussians, they felt, were in Ontario. The people who were against their language, against their Catholicism, they saw English Canada as the enemy. But the French Canadians who did go, often for very idealistic reasons, and as members of the Royal 22nd Regiment, as it came to be known in the 1920s, it was the 22nd French Canadian Battalion during the war. It was the only French-speaking regiment in the entire array of the British Empire. And they knew that. And the officers were very, very keen to make sure, here's a lieutenant, that they did not let down the reputation of their people. And so the commander of the Royal 22nd was a man named Thomas Tremblay, who was a very strict disciplinarian. 5 out of the 25 Canadian soldiers shot in the First World War with French Canadians, because they were out of the 22nd Regiment, because Tremblay insisted they were not going to give the people a bad name. They were not going to be an undisciplined regiment. He was very severe, very strict. And we forget, he was a hero in Quebec, as was Georges Vanier, or some of the people who came out of the Royal 22nd and became eminent figures in the years after the First World War. And we find this very religious and very patriotic sentiment here, God, take my life for thy glory and the glory of French Canada. So that even though most people in Quebec were adamantly opposed to the war, those who did go felt that they were upholding the honor of their own people. And this is a very common theme in the French Canadian epitaphs, usually from officers. The ones whose families could probably speak English, who could deal with reforms that were sent in English. Most of the French Canadian graves don't have an epitaph because the soldiers are private. His family gets a form in English, and what do you do with that? So, in other words, it's only the officers who are sort of the upper crust, but there's a sense of noblesse oblige among the officers. They were the cream of Quebec society. It was on their shoulders what the honor of the people was. And they took that duty very, very seriously. And again in the Second World War, if you read some of the memoirs of French Canadian soldiers from World War II in the 22nd Regiment, say, we're not going to let down the guys that went before. The guys who fought at Courcelette, the guys who fought in 100 days. And in the Royal 22nd in Italy, they often evoke the memory of the First World War battles that inspired their soldiers in the Second. Okay? And you get things like this. And here's a description in Danish. It's Private Victor Eagle Sorensen. I give this to my students. I say, what on earth is this guy doing here? The guy's from Denmark. It's a neutral country. What on earth do you want to get into this thing for? But there are 2 clues here. One, this guy's named Victor Hugo, after the French novelist. The family probably loves French literature, loves France, and it's part of the larger point that a lot of the foreign guys who served in the Canadian Army, and a lot of the American soldiers who came to fight for Canada, really were fighting for France. And they say that. I'm not here to fight for Britain or Canada. I'm here to fight for France. Like Benjamin Franklin, a man has 2 countries, his own in France. A lot of the Americans took that to heart. And a lot of the American university volunteers who came before 1917 did so out of love of France. And this guy, he's probably a real Francophile to begin with. And the second is this. Here's Denmark. It's a little neutral country right beside Germany. You also have quite a few epitaphs in Dutch volunteers, another little neutral country right beside Germany. They saw what happened in Belgium. And they probably thought, well, if they can do it to Belgium, if they win, they're going to do it to us. So we better make sure that we get them first. And the other thing is, too, the Danes had a toll to pick with the Germans as well, going back to the 1860s when 2 provinces that were between Denmark and Germany were annexed by Prussia. And this was a very traumatic event in Danish history, this sort of forced cession of territory to Germany. And a lot of Danes had a chip on their shoulder about that. So for historical reasons, personal reasons, the Francophile, and I think the idea that when the Germans went into Belgium, they showed that anything was possible. So a lot of these guys say, well, we'll get ahead of the game here. We'll see if we can't settle up with the Germans before they come and take our country too. Okay? Here's another interesting one. You do find a few in foreign languages. In the First World War, you find a lot that are in Welsh Gaelic or Scots Gaelic. And a lot of the guys who came from Britain they didn't speak English, they spoke Welsh or they spoke Scots Gaelic. And then, of course, it's not, the country was very, very British at the time. We're starting to get the first waves of immigration beginning to change the essential Britishness of English Canada. But you do get the odd language. You get many, many more in the Second World War. The Second World War epitaphs had nearly 20 languages. In the First World War, not quite as many, but the tip of the iceberg is there. And here's a guy whose epitaph is in Czech. And so may the earth of Belgium be light upon you, pride of the Czech motherland. And I think this guy was probably there not to fight the Germans, but maybe get a shot in at the Austro-Hungarians, because they were the ones oppressing his people in Czechoslovakia, what became Czechoslovakia. So here's one of the subject minorities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire thinking, well, I'll go and serve the Canadian Army, and maybe that will liberate my people from the yoke of Austro-Hungarian rule. There's another one, which I haven't got here, but I'll just mention it, is in Serbia. And it says he died for his fatherland and for his ally, which means he died for Serbia and Canada, which was allied with Serbia. And think of all the countries we think we're allied with. We know Serbia doesn't leap to mind. But here's a Serbian volunteer thinking, I can strike a blow for Serbia by fighting for Canada. And they put that in Serbian on the grave, it's a Canadian grave. So this remarkable confluence of stories and motivations and sort of intertwined histories of ourselves, other countries, and the allies of the Great War. Okay. Now here's an American. And he had a chip on his shoulder, volunteered for the USA to avenge the Lusitania murder. When the Germans sank Lusitania, they almost brought the Americans into the war in May of 1915, and they only barely stayed out. But some of the Americans, they were so incensed by it, they came up to Canada to go and get back at the Germans for sinking the passenger liner. So in other words, sometimes the motivations are quite remarkable here. As I was saying before, a lot of the American volunteers who were killed in the Canadian service will mention they came to fight for a cause. It wasn't an American cause, but it was for France. So again, it's a little bit of a chance to reconstruct the motivations of pull some individuals out of the crowd and see that the events of the war had an immediate impact. The Lusitania sinkings were known to us, but it was enough to get him in the army of a foreign country and go get himself killed in Flanders. Okay? Here's one that's rather interesting. Many died and there was much glory. Very, very few epitaphs. I think it's less than 10 that I've ever seen. Go against the grain. Say something that's embittered. Say something that is contrary to the prevailing spirit. And here's one where you think, oh, a lot of people got killed for what? And there are a couple of gravestones. There's an Australian one, hearts broken, lives thrown away for what? There's a British one, our dear son, a growing young man killed for nothing. But they're so rare, they stand out all the more as a result. And so every now and then you get something like this, and you were allowed to say it. The most famous one is a British father whose son had been shot for cowardice. He put that on the headstone, shot at dawn, a worthy son of his father and one of the first to enlist. And the commission looked at us and said, do you really want that? Say, yes, I do. I want that honest headstone. I want people to know what happened to him. All right. So there were limits. There was, I wouldn't call it censorship. It was more the idea of taste here. You couldn't say, God damn those sons who killed my boy. There were people who did try to say that. But if you wanted to pick another way to say that, and I'll show you a way or two you can do that in a moment, as long as the sentiment wasn't too rash or too emotional, you could say what you wanted. And in many of the cemeteries, there are these rather guarded expressions of bitterness, of anger, and a sense of waste. There's another famous one coming up in a moment. I'm going to show you that. This is one of the ones I mentioned. Sacrifice of the fallacy of war and end war. And that's in Time Caught in Passchendaele as well. So again, it gives you an idea of the length that the commission was prepared to go to allow people to say what they wanted. And so here's a young man whose father said, talk about the war to end all wars, I'm not buying that. I'm not buying it. Many people did. There were epitaphs that said, my son died for a better world, there shall be no more war, he died to bring peace to the world. Many people did wish to believe that, especially after the Americans came in 1917 and the war turned into a kind of a crusade with Woodrow Wilson framed it with 14 points. They built a better world, not the world that would cause the war, but the world that would put an end to it. So not everyone bought into it, though. But often you get this kind of idealism. And here's a Newfoundland soldier killed on the Somme on July the 1st, and he said, be ashamed to die until you have gained some victory for humanity. And so it's heartbreaking, Here's a young man, far from home, and his family puts something ennobling on his grave, and so many of them do. You can imagine the anguish of these families. And yet, in this moment of sorrow, what they're trying to do is put something that will redeem the memory of the soldier, and then put something ennobling on his grave so that strangers will see it. And here it is in France, and how many French people are going to read that and understand it. In other words, it's kind of almost like people put those papers in a bottle and throw it into the ocean, hoping someone will pick it up. I think that's what you've got here. This effect that somebody will recognize this. Someone will recognize it on some meals. fighting for something more than himself. You say, this is the sample here. As I said before, you can say what you wanted to as long as you said it properly. The best way to get around the question of good taste was to use scriptural quotations or biblical language. This is, yet remember this, dawn on our good cause, fight upon our side. People did believe that this was a war for the salvation of Christianity. The soldiers were the emulators of Christ, the way that they sacrificed, the way that Christ had sacrificed. And many soldiers say that I am following in his footsteps of Christ on the cross. So that became a very, very poignant and very powerful kind of consolation of families that their sons had emulated the Redeemer of mankind. Their sacrifice to redeem the world when peace came. And then some of the soldiers read, often they had annotated Bibles. And there were passages they would read every day in order to calm their fears or to keep them on the right path. There's some very interesting Bibles from Canadian soldiers, which is sort of a reading schedule. A bit of the Psalms, a bit of the New Testament. These are daily readings. And so the family picked this one. When you guys are looking for assurance, the time I am afraid I will trust in thee. In other words, the things he would read maybe under shellfire, and maybe when things got a little hot, was to remind himself that there was something that could cushion his fears. And the idea, too, these young men who died in aging in early ages. And there's this promise from Scripture in the book of Hebrews, I will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. In other words, there will be a reward for these guys. They're an elect. And it's almost as though it's a promise or it's a renewal of the covenant between God and mankind that these people will get the reward, if not on this earth, in the world to come. You find that many, many times in these headstones. The families seeking the promise of divine favor or divine thankfulness for the sacrifice of the soldiers and the trials of this world. And then sometimes you get this, by this I know about favors to me, that my enemy does not triumph against you. In other words, you didn't let Germany win, did you, God? You didn't let that happen. And then scatter that with people that delight in war. Since that's a veiled call, I think, to punishing the Germans after the war. They started it. They're the ones that love this stuff. So scatter the people that delight in war. And calling for divine retribution upon the enemy. Just to say, these are ways to sort of step around the bitterness of the feelings and phrase it in language that no one can turn back. You can't refuse a scriptural quotation. Okay? And then some of them are just too much. I mean, this one, the only child of aging parents. I mean, that's just stabs in the heart. The parents like, we can never replace this child. It's a loss that we will live with the rest of our lives. There's nothing we can do about it. 16, 15. The next one, this one, this is what lost it. I was a girl. That is not a barrier to love daddy. From a girl named Kate. Lives in Trenton, Ontario. And I think any parent can use that and just melt. Sometimes they're just so effective. They're so simple. And it's so powerful in the economy of expression. But I think that one is the one that, for me, was absolutely devastating. You can imagine yourself, for your own child, saying goodbye to you forever. Not all of the inscriptions are in France or Flanders, and many are here in Canada. I mean, anytime you go by the veterans plot, you can see here, and these are the guys we really forget. You think of the glorious dead in France and Flanders, and then what about the guys who came back and coughed up the rest of their lives in the Veterans Hospital in 1920? Here's a guy down here, gassed in the saw in 1918. He lived long enough to come home to die, is what happened, basically. All these other guys died in Davisville Hospital, and died here at, I think it was a Western Hospital. In other words, they make it home, they die in the Veterans War, and they're buried at public expense. Some of these little plaques, and they are completely forgotten. But I think that's where the research should be going, actually, is what happened to these poor souls who either made it in the 1920s, or if you go to the veterans plots, you see how many of them died in the 40s and the 50s. They were worn out by the war. They weren't killed in battle, but the war killed them anyway. So then there's that kind of poignancy about these guys who aren't on their graves overseas. They're at least forgotten because here at home. And I think if one were to sum it up, that was probably a common feeling after the war on a British headstone here. Definitely the price of victory overall for the war was. It really wasn't worth it. Which a lot of people might question after the war. Again, what answer is there to that? And of course, I think that was the earnest hope of the epitaphs and the gravestones. I think the earnest hope of some of the memorials. But as we know, this was not to be the case. And I want to show you a couple more as I end, just to say that it has echoes Here's the grave of Lieutenant Fred Fisher, Canadian Brigade of Guards, who was killed in Normandy on the 8th of August. He followed the tradition of his family and his namesake, Fred Fisher, BC, 1914 to 1918. This is a very, very common thing on the Canadian epitaphs for the Second World War. The allusion to an uncle, a father, killed in the First World War. And often what happened is that in the case of Fred Fisher, the famous BC, the first Canadian to win BC, his two brothers survived the war. As was very common, the brothers come home, they named their first son after the brother was killed overseas. That brother takes the name back and is killed as well. There are two Fred Fishers buried, one from the First World War, one from the Second. Very, very common. Another one I saw was astounding was the wife said, my dear husband, her name was Vinnie Ridge Piercy. They're naming their kids after these things. So, in other words, the way the First World War kept echoing in the minds of Canadians all the way to the Second World War, so you do have these echoes of the families or of the commemoration of the First World War in the epitaphs there. We've got another one. This is on the men in gate that I showed you earlier. This is Stephen Carman Bird, who was the brother of Will Bird, the famous author who wrote Ghosts of Warm Hands, a number of stories about the First World War. One of the reasons Will Bird went overseas is that his brother had been killed and he was going to avenge him. His brother's body was never found, but, if I may show the next one, Will Bird survived the war, came home, named his son Stanley, Stephen Stanley Bird, after his lost brother. And Stephen Stanley Bird was killed in Normandy on 8th of July 1944. It was Will Bird who wrote the history of the North Nova Scotia Highlands, a book in which he had to describe his own son's death in action. And in the Ghosts of Warm Hands, he tells that remarkable, eerie story of being in the trench and seeing his brother appear before him. And his brother silently took him and led him away from the place that he was. And a few minutes later, a shell came down and hit the spot. All Bird's friends thought he must have been killed, but he had to have this eerie experience of having his brother's ghost come and lead him away from that. A story he tells in Ghosts of Warm Hands, which may be a tall tale, maybe one of those strange things we can't explain, but in other words, naming his son after his brother, very, very important, very symbolic for him, of course, his son is killed in the Second World War. And then the last